After the Civil War, pictures weren't the only thing viewed in black and white. Many Americans were strongly opinionated about the issue of slavery, which resulted in the Great Divide in the country. This ultimately led to the Civil War and the freedom of African American slaves, thus evolving into the Civil Rights Movement. What events and influences led to the rise of the Civil Rights Movement in the mid-1900s?
Well, you can go all the way back to the very beginning of slavery. And essentially, this modern-day civil rights movement, what you're referencing in the 1960s, we just kind of put a title to it in history. But you can go back to the slave revolts on some of the slave ships, maybe the Amistad, for example. You have had individuals, in particular people of color, African Americans, that have, since the early 1400s, been seeking equality. And we just would see that pursuit continue into, 1700s and 1800s and 1900s and so on and so forth. But it was essentially over equality, and I think you can look at the fact that our country had a civil war over it. We were talking really about the issue of slavery and states seceding from the Union, which was, over the issue of slavery. And I think, when it comes to race in our country, it has always been and will continue to be an ongoing discussion.
The Civil Rights Movement began during the Reconstruction immediately following the Civil War. The Civil War was a dispute over several issues including slavery, states' rights, economic conditions in the South, and Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. The result of the Civil War was the passing of the 15th Amendment, forbidding the practice of slavery or involuntary servitude. As the nation became more aware of issues in America, citizens began to demand change.
Following the Civil War, black codes were enacted between the years of 1800 and 1866, which better controlled the newly freed slaves. Between 1876 and 1965, Jim Crow laws were passed. They segregated races and made it nearly impossible for African Americans to vote. Both of these measures showed white supremacy. The Progressive Era addressed many problems facing Americans. Civil rights was not one of the main issues fixed during this time. In 1896, the landmark court case of Plessy v. Ferguson ruled that segregation was allowed in public facilities and school as long as it was separate but equal. In response to the unjust treatment, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was formed in 1909 by W.E.B. Du Bois. Another important reformer during this time was Booker T. Washington. He believed minorities should first better themselves and equality would come with time.
Preceding the Progressive Era were the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of racial tension. Many Americans clashed over equal rights. In the summer of 1919, racial violence between blacks and whites erupted. Then in the 20s, the KKK was revived and increased in size. They committed many crimes against minorities such as African Americans, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. During this time, many lynchings also took place. The NAACP put their efforts into passing an anti-lynching law, which failed in passing the Senate. But they did have limited success in improving law enforcement at the state level. Eventually, the number of lynchings decreased with time. Another signature of the 20s was a shift in culture. Jazz was a type of music that involves improvisation. It evolved from ragtime and blues of the South. During the 20s, the Harlem Renaissance also took place. It was a time of literary awakening in the African American community. They wrote songs, poems, novels, and other forms of literature to speak out about the injustices they have experienced. Harlem, New York grew from 50,000 African Americans in 1914 to over 200,000 in 1930. It was a very important cultural center.
As time went on, the civil rights movement picked up momentum in the mid-1900s. Various figures rose to fame such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Ruby Bridges, and Malcolm X. During the 1960s, legislative and executive branches took action to support equal rights.
How does the civil rights movement tie into the theme of cultural contact and conflict?
Well, I think you don't have a need for the movement if you didn't have some of the atrocities and certainly the misunderstandings that happen because of the contact component. I mean, whenever you have two different cultures that come together, there's going to be disputes because they don't understand each other. And my perspective has always been that, unfortunately, you have to kind of go through these growing pains of getting to know each other. Usually one group tries to inflict unnecessary control over the other group, And it'll take a series of decades, if not centuries, for kind of that, for lack of a better term, that minority group to finally say, no, this is not okay the way that you've been treating us. And now it's our chance to try to at least be on even par with you and try to correct wrongs from the past. So, we really don't have one without the other.
The rise of African American influence began around the 1950s. The Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was a historic ruling. On May 17, 1954, the court unanimously decided the separate but equal doctrine was unconstitutional. This prevented segregation in
How did
schools.
boycotts, speeches, and marches help the civil rights movement drastically?
Civil disobedience and the power of song, for example, were tremendous because it gave people hope, it gave people meaning. But again, you have to see, for example, the power of song that always goes back to the days of slaves when they were working in fields and would usually sing to bide the time. And we saw blues kind of grow out of the tradition of it, and kind of people talking about some of the personal persecutions that they faced or the problems that they faced, and song, and to the point where public outcry, and civil disobedience, the acts of going to the modern day civil rights movement of such leaders as Martin Luther King and many others would show that they could have a profound effect on individuals. But for the public to see them and hear them are probably the big key components of what we consider the modern day civil rights era.
On December 1st, 1955, the monumental bus boycott was ignited by a seamstress named Rosa Parks. She had also been part of the NAACP for 12 years. On the bus, she took a seat in the colored section. Then a white man boarded the bus, and there were no other seats, so he demanded hers. She refused. At the next stop, she was arrested. Parks was put on trial for violating segregation laws. After Parks was arrested, civil rights leaders, such as Martin Luther King, organized a bus boycott in Montgomery. Many African Americans refused to use the transportation system until it was desegregated. This caused bus companies to lose money, but they still refused to desegregate. Almost a year later, 50,000 African Americans participated in the boycott. Finally, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled bus segregation was unconstitutional.
Many nonviolent protests popped up around this time, such as the Greensboro sit-in. In February of 1960, 4 African American students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College sat at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter. Even though they were refused service, they were allowed to sit at the counter. This triggered many similar student sit-ins throughout the South and was very effective. 6 months later, the 4 students were served lunch at the same Woolworth's counter. This method of protest was used to desegregate other public places, such as swimming pools, public parks, libraries, and theaters.
In the fall of 1957, the governor of Arkansas would not enforce integration, despite the previous ruling of Brown v. Board of Education. The governor placed National Guard troops at Central High School to refuse entry of African American students. Many whites, like the governor, did not want integration. They protested outside the school. Although President Eisenhower was not in support of the civil rights movement, he still enforced integration to protect the authority of the Supreme Court as well as himself. He sent soldiers to escort the African American students to class. In 1961, Cora and SNCC organized and carried out freedom rides. The ride's purpose was to test if southern states would follow the law and allow African Americans to ride interstate buses. In the Deep South, many riders were confronted with violence. For example, in Anniston, Alabama, a white mob slashed the bus's tires and threw a firebomb into the bus. When riders escaped, many were beaten by the mob. Freedom rides continued throughout the summer, and Kennedy sent federal marshals to protect the riders.
What groups were for equal rights? What were their strategies to achieve equal rights?
Well, you have lots of different organizing mechanisms that took place in the 1960s. The SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was big because it involved spirituality and faith. And, you saw a lot of people that were actively pursuing freedom, but doing it in a peaceful means while kind of holding steady to their faith as well. The student efforts in SNCC that would help college campuses merge to fight, this persecution and oppression, so to speak, really came to the forefront as well. But you had so many different groups, so many different organizations, and you also have to consider, I suppose, the Black separatist movement, which emerged during this time period, which was a bit different than what they had going on down in the South.
There were many groups in favor of civil rights. Some of the groups were the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president. One reason is because he helped Martin Luther King Jr. when he was arrested and faced 4 months of hard labor. He persuaded the judge to lessen King's sentencing. Word spread throughout the African American community, and he had many blacks vote for him. The March on Washington took place in August 1963. More than 200,000 people attended to protest for jobs and freedom. Speakers at the march included celebrities like James Baldwin, Jackie Robinson, and Bob Dylan. At this march, Martin Luther King Jr.